Welcome to Two Travel Dads Podcast. Here we share our favorite destinations, travel tips, stories from our adventures, and bring on awesome guests to share insights into their travelsome lives. Be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and check out our detailed show notes at twotraveldads.com/podcast-episodes. Hey, welcome back to another episode of Two Travel Dads Podcast. I am your loyal host, Rob Taylor. And I've got my wonderful friend Colleen back with me today to share more about, so she's this fantastic photographer, and we previously have shared all about her journey as a photographer and publisher. And today we are going to dig into one of her both favorite tourist and photographic destinations, which is Acadia National Park. I love Acadia. So thank you, Colleen, for joining me again. I appreciate your time, your knowledge, and your banter.
Thank you, Rob. It's so great to be back. We're back, right?
We're back. Only we're less creepy than that.
I know.
So
we are.
So Acadia National Park, I know it holds a special place in your heart for a couple different reasons. When I think of Acadia, I think of really specifically like Cadillac Mountain and the views, the granite, the really cool kind of subalpine trail system, even though you can see the water. That's the first thing that always comes to my mind. What do you think of when you think of Acadia? You've had a lot more experience there than I have.
Yeah, so for me, coming from the desert, my big draw to Acadia was all the water. Like, we don't have a whole lot of water in Arizona, and so to have like these miles of beautiful granite coastlines, and the trees. Yeah, we don't have so many trees.
And if you don't know, Acadia National Park is in Maine. It is down in Maine. So yeah, just in case you're just joining us and aren't familiar with all things Northeast or water-centric USA, that's where Acadia is. But so that makes sense. Yeah, living in the desert, I can imagine being highly attracted to water and feeling the need to immerse myself.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
when did you first visit? Like, was it after you had been? Because I know you're not initially from Arizona. What did you get to visit as a young debutante, or is it more
No, actually, this sounds really sad, but I didn't even know it existed until about 2008. So the furthest east I had ever been was Syracuse, New York, and I don't know that we can say that that's all that far that east. So I was spending, so let's see, I had left my job in 2007. I was at Intel. I was a software engineer, and I moved into freelance photography in 2007, and I was spending a lot of time photographing the Oregon coast. I wasn't spending a whole lot of
favorite.
I know. Well, there's lots of similarities between Acadia and the Oregon coast. They're just on opposite sides of the country. But I was really not connecting visually with the desert. I love it. It's beautiful, but I couldn't get like the story, and I couldn't find my way, and I really wasn't feeling creative. But every time I'd go to the Oregon coast, man, oh boy, I just felt inspired and loved it. I was kind of in a creative rut, and I just so serendipitously ran into somebody who had done an artist in residence program at Petrified Forest here in Arizona, a national park in Arizona. And I Googled it, and at the top of the list of the National Park Service artist in residencies was this place I had never heard of. It was Acadia. And it was like, all right, well, I'll Google that. And I started typing, and it was like, oh, this looks a lot like Oregon. And I've never been there before. This is surely going to give me a creative jolt. And I just needed something new. I needed something else to do. And so I could have never have imagined what it had, all the gifts that it had given to me over the many, many years that I've been there. But I ended up applying for the artist in residency and getting it in 2009. I went in 2009 for about 3 weeks. I loved it so much that I applied again and received a residency in October 2010 so that I could experience fall colors.
Second
and
one.
I loved it. Yeah, exactly. And I loved it so much. They couldn't get rid of me. I applied a third time and was the park's first winter artist in residencies. That's right, folks. The girl who had no coat was Acadia's first winter artist in residency. And
Wow.
so, yeah, so since then I've been going, on personal trips. I teach workshops out there. I have loads of friends on the island. Like it's kind of a second home to me now. And so yeah, I like I said, I would have never have guessed that I would have fallen in love with an island on the other side of the country, but here we are.
That's awesome. So when you are doing, I know you've got a whole presentation about what it is to be an artist in residence stuff, but we're going to do podcast questions. Um,
Okay.
when you're artist in residence at
Yeah.
Acadia, are you staying in the Bass Harbor Lighthouse? Do they put you up in a cabin off the carriage roads? Where are you?
So where I stayed was on the Schoodic Peninsula in the SERC campus. So that's the old Navy base that is now turned into a research and education center. And so that's about an hour and 15 minutes from Bar Harbor, which is on Mount Desert Island or MDI. That's kind of where most of the tourists kind of hang out is Bar Harbor. But I had the benefit of experiencing two parts of the park. So Schoodic Peninsula is the only part of the park on the mainland, and the island, with just an hour and 15-minute drive. And so today I think there is an opportunity to stay in one of the carriage houses right by Jordan Pond. That at the time was not an option for me, but it's, some time has passed. I had originally, in my third artist in residency, actually applied to stay at a backcountry cabin on the remote island of Isla Ho, and the winter opportunity was presented, and that's what I went after. And so I have since been to Isla Ho on my own, but yeah, there's a few different options now that artist in residence in Acadia can pursue.
That's awesome. Gosh, I've never gotten to do artist in residence, but that would
Oh,
be
you'd be great.
Oh my gosh, I would love it. I would love to do that here in Florida, like at like Fort Matanzas here on the island or down in the Everglades. Oh, that'd be amazing. And just like paint and write for several weeks. Sounds dreamy.
Well, so here's the thing. You can grant yourself that residency. Even if one doesn't exist, you can block 3 weeks of time, 2 weeks of time, 3 weeks of time, and just do that. And so
You make it sound so easy.
you have to throw your phone. No, what you gotta you gotta throw your phone in the water. You've got to I mean, that's part of it is that you're so I mean, in Acadia, you're still connected. I mean, like I'm still answering emails and I'm still, trying to maintain business, but just being isolated from, the majority of your work was really helpful. I did turn my phone off for most of it. I did not answer emails for most of it. So I treated it very much like an immersive experience. And you can do that. You don't
I
even have
know.
to.
I know we don't need authorization to do such things. It's true. But so when you are doing it as part of a program like that, so I know like when a
Right.
client brings me to a destination, I've got some deliverables and I've got some creative
Right.
goals for what I need. What is it that either the National Park Service or what did you set up for yourself in terms of goals of, I've got this time, this dedicated time in this beautiful, pristine area. What is
Right.
the actual like kind of deliverable or outcome of doing something like that? And you can tell me per season if it varies.
It did kind of vary actually. So at a higher level, generally what the parks are going to expect is that when you come into a residency, you're going to offer some sort of public program. In Acadia, that was a student program, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And sometimes it varies, but it's generally like you want to do one public presentation or some form of public interaction once a week. And then the other is that you deliver a one finished piece to their archives, to their galleries, to wherever that place is in the park. You donate one finished piece from your residency. Now, what you do with your time there, and that's the big gift, is up to you. And for me, it changed over time. When I first applied, my goals was to simply learn about a new place, build a new portfolio of, scenery that was so unlike my own. And then I absolutely wanted to work with the kids in Schoodic Education Adventure, or the C program. It's a middle-aged program for kids. They come into Acadia, they stay at SERC, they stay on the Schoodic Peninsula for a number of nights in dorms, and they learn about geology and GPS and tide pooling and science and art in this national park, which is it's a remarkable program for young kids. And so and then actually, ironically, I wrote in my first application that I wanted to write a book of experiences about my time as an artist in residence, and that evolved obviously over my 3 residencies. But I actually applied for the second residency. I was in love with Acadia, but my biggest concern with my first residency is that nobody was there in November. And so I reapplied specifically to work with the kids in C. I had this idea that I wanted to start a photojournalism program, and that had remarkable support from the C program, Schoodic Institute, and the National Park. And so I went back in October just to do that. Yes, I was there at Fall Colors and I did photograph Fall Colors, but I did help start that photojournalism program, which is in place today, and it's just awesome. Like that's like one of the highlights of my career. And then the third residency for me, how I was going to use my time was simply to just see the park in a new light, and to continue building that portfolio. What ended up coming out of that residency was really 2 things. One is I started writing the first edition of my Photographing Acadia guidebook, which does include, yeah, there it is.
I was literally just flipping through it.
Yeah. Well, and so yeah, I didn't intend to write a guidebook, but I did inject some of my personal experiences into the guidebook. But I really wanted people to enjoy this beautiful place in their own way, in their own light, in their own lens. And so the other thing that came out of it, and it was a little bit more evolutionary, was that I changed as a photographer in my third residency. And that was not something I wrote about. That was not something that I was expecting that was going to happen, but it transformed me entirely. And so I went from a photographer who liked to take pretty pictures to a photographer who wanted to tell my own stories, expressing my own stories through the mechanism of photography. And so I changed from a technically proficient photographer into a more creative one. And I didn't think that was ever possible, just because I grew up being told I wasn't really that creative. I was left brain, I was over analytical. And so that transformation has taken time. But that's in the third residency is when that started. I got really bored and stuck, and I thought that I had photographed everything there was to photograph in Acadia, and that's ludicrous. And so, anyway,
I can't wait to read about that in your next book, Creativity in Residency, coming to shelves in 2025.
well, it's actually, I have to look it up. Let me look it up. The story about finding my creative voice is actually in the Acadia second edition. I did a second edition of the guidebook because I learned so much about creativity from being in Acadia. And so that story, at least the small version of it, is in the Acadia book on page 180,
Okay.
in case you
Well,
want to know.
dog ear it.
Yeah.
Perfect. So with that then, gosh, you got to spend so much time and really you learned a lot. It sounds like you've changed, you evolved in your own way.
Hmm.
Do you feel like as you really started to dig in and, photograph Acadia and think about like what you could be teaching students while you're in this atmosphere, do you think that your photographic style, you were saying that you were becoming much more creative versus, thriving on the technical side of things. Do you feel like this is when your love of getting down to the nitty gritty, to the technical, to the macro of things? As I was flipping through, I was like, oh, look at this beautiful ice that you have going on. Is that where that specific love and interest came from?
Yeah, so that actually came from that third artist in residency, where I got stuck. And the story goes that I learned from a fourth grader how to be a creative photographer. He had run down the trail, he had lost his mind over a mushroom, and he hadn't made a photograph. He hadn't made a photograph out of it at all. And he looked at me and he goes, "I think I want to be a photographer just like you someday." And I was like, oh my gosh. That was in my second residency, but in my third residency, when I got stuck and I was remembering that experience, I was remembering and I was starting to ponder, I was starting to analyze. I was like, that little boy thinks that being a photographer means you run around losing your mind over mushrooms. And that's absolutely not anything that I do. I just go out with my gear at sunrise and sunset. I hope and pray that there's a great, pretty sunset or a sunrise, and I make a photograph with a stick in the foreground because there's rule of thirds. And so that little boy taught me that I should run around Acadia looking for my metaphorical mushrooms, right? Like, which is hilarious, right? So what I did in that moment is I was like, okay, I'm going to let curiosity drive my photos, my photography. So what am I curious about? What is cool here? And I lost my mind over the ice. Again, we don't have a lot of ice in Phoenix, Arizona, ever. And so I learned that there's also, I thought, ice is ice. It's not. There's pancake ice, there's frazzle ice, there's grease ice, there's so many different types of ice and the formations and bubbles. And like, so I found my metaphorical mushrooms like through ice and that idea that we can make photographs based on our life experiences and our moments as opposed to just snapping the shutter and making them pretty. And I think that moment has helped me create deeper stories of Acadia. I've been to Acadia now over 500 days since 2009. And I mean, it's like at one point before the pandemic, I was going, 2 to 3 months a year.
Wow.
And you think like you're going to run out of things to photograph. And the fact of the matter is that the story just gets deeper, like, and the magic just gets multiplied because you're seeing way beyond the surface level of this place that means so much to you. And so I have a fourth grader to thank.
I love that. That's amazing. I've got a third grader in the house who makes me constantly reevaluate almost everything that I do, both in terms of my own actions and my
Yeah.
creativity. And it's kind of cool what kids how they kind of bring you back. I love it.
Right? I
But
mean, that's what we should be doing as adults is kind of going back to our happiest childhood memories and playing like a fourth grader. Because, I mean, think about how exciting the world was to you when you were third grade, right? And fourth grade. Like, there's so much new out there.
yeah,
The term that I use to teach is a Zen Buddhism term called Shoshen, and it's to have a beginner's mind. A beginner's mind is that you have an openness and a kind of a receptiveness to seeing things as if you've never seen them before. And that is hard to do in a place that maybe you love, or maybe even a place that you live, right? Where we get so accustomed and kind of habituated to the same thing over and over again. But if you're willing to pay attention and you're willing to dig a little bit deeper, like there is magic going on all the time in so many different ways in places that you see all the time. And so you just have to be willing to look for it.
that's beautifully said. So
Hmm.
with that and knowing that, you want to go and find magic and we're talking about Acadia, what do you think is really the most magical place that you've gotten to just like really immerse yourself within Acadia National Park? I mean, I love Maine. We spend a lot of time in Mid-Coast Maine. So what is your jam within the park?
I mean, the answer to that is yes, the whole park.
No, I need you to be a little tiny bit more specific, just a little bit.
Okay. Well, so of course, it depends. My first draw is to water. So when I show up for the first time, I go out to a little place, a little special place of mine on the cove. Yeah, and it's a little cove on Ocean Drive, and so I love the coast at sunrise. However, there is nothing better than the aerial view that you get from places like Cadillac Mountain or Door Mountain or Gorham Mountain. And it's just a totally different perspective. You can still see all the water. Rob, the listeners can't see this, but there's a beautiful view behind Rob right now of the Porcupine Islands and from the top of Cadillac Mountain. And it's just so inspiring. You can see forever. And so, whether you're seeing mountains of Maine or you're seeing out into the Atlantic Ocean. Like that's just a fabulous view. And then I think the other, if you kind of like forests and whatnot, one of the most magical places for me is Sourdemont, and there's a couple of different spots. There's the Tarn, which is real kind of nearby, but there's the Jessup Path, there's Great Meadow, kind of all in that same area. And Sourdemont is the heart, is literally the heart of Acadia. It is where the first piece of donated land came from, and it has beautiful foliage, but kind of what I find interesting, at least photographically, is that it is the place where you can see the pre 1970 1947 fire and the post 1947 fire. Mount Desert Island had a fire in 1947. It burned a fair amount of the island, and it enabled a fair bit of deciduous trees to grow in its path. And so we have these phenomenal fall colors, because of Maine's ecosystems, but also because of this fire. And on the Jessup Path, if you walk on it, on the west side, on the left side, as you start the path, is where all the hemlock growth is. That's the old growth. And where the birches and the grasses are is the new growth. And I love seeing history. Like that's it. Like you're
Yeah.
watching history as you're walking the path. And so there's a lot of history in that place anyway, but that's another special place to me.
Yeah, and I know there's a visitor center there too that kind of digs into some of that.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Mm-hmm.
well, I always think about like what is it that we need to visit next time because I've got kids with me and we try to turn every trip into like a slice of learning, and that's one of those spots that's really great to actually like have science right in front of you.
Yeah.
It's pretty.
Yes. That visitor center is fantastic. The wild gardens of Acadia is right there, and they have all the labels, and it's different ecosystems. All the different ecosystems are represented, that are within Acadia, and it is a fascinating place to learn about the world. So about
So then,
Acadia.
so then what are the other, because I mean, most people are just, going to Mount Desert Island and, checking out the stuff that's on the loop road or, taking bikes and doing the carriage trails and going to Bass Head and stuff like that. So you've got the peninsula and then you've got Isle Haute. What is the, what's the draw of each of these more remote places? I mean, remote, there's the answer right there. They're more remote. Besides the fact that they're more remote, what do you feel is really the draw of each of these kind of units of the park?
Yeah, so I mean, the majority of the visitors go to Mount Desert Island. They stay in Bar Harbor, maybe, some of the other little cities, some of the little other towns around there. But that's kind of where like a lot of development is. Like you're going to have the fancy restaurants, and you're going to have great food, and you're going to have entertainment, and things like that. Much more accessible. If you want, one of the things about Mount Desert Island, well, one of the things about Acadia is there's not a whole lot of backcountry camping. So like for those people who are more familiar with like Western national parks where like Death Valley, where you could just wander for hours and you could do backcountry camping and things like that. There isn't really a backcountry to Acadia. It's
A
a lot of front.
backcountry scene.
Right. There's not a backcountry scene. You can absolutely camp on the island. There are a number of campgrounds, on Mount Desert Island, but it's going to be more developed. When we talk about Schoodic Peninsula, it is the only part of the park that's on the mainland, which I mentioned earlier. But fascinatingly enough, they believe that only about 10% of the visitors to Acadia ever make it out to there. And so it's only an hour and 15-minute drive from Bar Harbor, and they call it the quiet side of Acadia, and it is a beautiful drive. There are not as many deciduous trees, so if you're looking for fall colors, Mount Desert Island is probably your better bet. But the drive, the loop drive, you've got Schoodic Mountain, you've got Schoodic Point. You've got plenty of hiking, plenty of coastline. It's a remarkable place to be kind of off the beaten path. And then
That's something that's sorry to interrupt for a
oh
second.
no, please.
You just like hit on such an important point because when you talk to Mainers and you mention Acadia, half of them are like, "Oh my gosh, it's my favorite," and the other half are like, "Oh my gosh, that's where all the tourists go. It's so busy." And I
Right.
think that you really hit it on the head that going out to the Schoodic Peninsula, that is a great option to see a side of Acadia that isn't traffic saturated. Because I'll tell you, if you go in the summer and you're doing the loop on Mount Desert Island, holy moly, you will.
Oh yeah.
And then and it's got the shuttle going on, which is great. And like if you can do the shuttle, do it because then you don't have to like sit in traffic and get road rage. You could just sit there and enjoy the
Please don't do
view.
that. Yeah. Or go way early in the morning, like at sunrise or sunset. It usually gets less populated. Or go, hike about a quarter mile off the beaten path. That's the buses can't get there, and they
Yeah,
usually don't.
yeah.
So
So
yeah,
then
but
the other
Schoodic
spot,
is definitely quiet.
yeah, and then Ilahote, the other one. I haven't.
Yeah, I yeah.
Uh,
You gotta
I
have
love.
you
I
gotta
can't
do it
stop.
with a French flair, Rob. Come on, like give me a
I
little
love.
hello, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know
Well,
what that was,
I don't know what that was. That wasn't French. It was something
but it
else.
was cute. It was very cute. This is cute.
Watching it was
Uh,
adorable. So what do we find out there at Ilahote?
it's High Island, so in French. And so that's a completely different, that's a wild experience. So the only way that you can get to this island is by mailboat or your own boat. If you have your own boat, bring your own boat. And which is, yeah, I don't ever do, but
Yeah.
so it's about a 45-minute hour boat ride to the island. The island is 6 miles long, 2 miles wide. The top part of the island, the north part of the island, is civilized. There are people who actually live there. I think there's less than 100 people that live on the island, and then the south part is all Acadia Park or Acadia National Park, and it's pristine, pristine, pristine backcountry. So like it's about as close to a backcountry experience as you're going to get. You're not permitted to camp outside, outside of the campground. There is a campground there. You can sometimes get lucky with a VRBO. I think there's a place called there's a lighthouse inn, maybe. I'm not sure of the exact name right off the top of my head, but there's a place that you can rent a room. But it is gorgeous hiking. It is wild coastlines, cliffs, rocks, waves, interesting, fascinating geology, and you're gonna see very few people there. We spent a week there. We had rented a house, with my folks, and I think we saw maybe three other people other than the town. Like that was it for a week. And
That's
so,
amazing.
but it takes effort. It takes a lot of effort and a lot of planning, things like that. So, but it is totally worth it.
So geology rocks for one. That's one of
Oh
my
yeah.
favorite things. I love geology.
Yes.
Uh,
Yes.
so then the other side of that though is with fewer people, do you find that there's more wildlife? Because that's what I've found to be kind of the bummer to me about Acadia is that it isn't rampant with wildlife like we've seen in other places. I've seen plenty of deer, lots of
Right.
birds, but besides that, not a ton of wildlife, which is what a lot of people associate with national parks. Do you find like the peninsula or out on the island that it's much better, or is this just not the zone for that?
Well, so on the islands, it's a little bit harder for mammals to get to. And so, especially with Idaho, it's a little bit further off the beaten path. I've seen other mammals on MDI, but certainly Schoodic, I think, has a bit more wildlife. At least it's the relationship between wildlife and people is different on Schoodic Peninsula. Like because there's just not as many people and you have more viewing opportunities, whereas I feel like in MDI they kind of just they have their little places, they stay to their places, they're not where people are. And so but that said, I've seen river otters on MDI, I've seen fox, I've seen the back end of a bear on around Schoodic Peninsula just
A
going
bare
into the park.
booty.
A bare booty, yeah, it was awesome. Porcupine are kind of everywhere. So they're out there, and I think you'd mentioned being in traffic jams. That's not the time that you're going to see the wildlife. Like the times you're going to see wildlife are when people are not around. So earlier in the morning, later in the evening. People do say that they see a moose on MDI. I've not yet seen him. I believe that there's bogs and
Mhm.
there's places where they could live, but I've only seen moose on the mainland. So,
Up in the
um,
highlands, like out.
yeah,
Yeah. So,
definitely, they're everywhere.
so before we wrap up, because we time limited assignment here, before we wrap up, if there was one key takeaway for somebody who wants to go visit Acadia for the first time, what would you say? Is it like a handy dandy planning tip, a must-see site, or just a frame of mind to approach it with? What's the one thing you would say if you had a minute to tell somebody about Acadia?
Oh my goodness.
I love putting people on the spot with these questions.
I know. I think I would be real focused about what your goal with the trip is. Is it to see the best of Acadia? Because if that's the case, then you'll definitely want to see things like you want to make reservations for Cadillac Mountain. You'll want to get up for sunrise along the ocean, Ocean Drive and hike Ocean Path. You'll want to get out to Bass Harbor Head Lighthouse. See some of the more iconic places. Sortimont, absolutely go to Sortimont to be at the heart of, the foundation of Acadia. But if you are looking for more of a little bit of a backcountry experience, a little bit more off the beaten path, definitely maybe consider some lesser known hikes. There's plenty. There's whether you like mountains or water, or rivers or streams or whatever. There's plenty on the island. Maybe not so much rivers on the island, but but certainly streams and brooks and things like that.
The
But I would
ponds
be
are
very
beautiful.
yeah, the ponds. I would be very, very clear about your intentions of what you want to see and what kind of experience you want to have, because you can find very, very peaceful, quiet sides on Mount Desert Island. You just have to be a little bit more off the beaten path. Or head to Schoodic. And Schoodic is going to require a little bit more planning because there's less lodging, there's less restaurants, things like that.
Not
Um,
everybody gets to be artists in residence.
yeah, yeah, right. How fortunate, right? So, but yeah, maybe you can apply, and maybe you can be. Maybe who knows?
And then what is your favorite season in Acadia? Is it fall
Yeah.
color season? Of course it is. Huh.
Actually, so I do love fall colors, but I tell you what, going in winter is special too. And again, I think it's just because I don't get a lot of winter in Arizona, but there's nobody there. It might be 55 degrees, it might be minus 26. Like you never know. And like that's kind of fun. Like like um yeah, so for me, I love the ice. I love the quiet. I love having places that are, usually are overrun with traffic and buses and things like that. I love having them completely to myself. So winter for me is a great time to go. I mean, fall is just a kaleidoscope. It's a celebration of color. It's like a party, right? And so, those are kind of my two favorite times. But I would argue, I've been in November, I've been in December. I would argue that there is no time to be a bad time to be in Acadia. So anytime you can get there is a good one.
There you have it. Cool. Well, you're going to have to make sure, listeners out there, that you check out the show notes because we're going to put all sorts of tips about visiting Acadia and links to Colleen's work so that you can check her out. And I was going to say, and you should try and get enrolled in one of her workshops at Acadia, but she tends to book out a year in advance or more. So there will be information about that in the show notes as well if you want to learn a little bit more. Colleen, thanks so much for being here with us. I appreciate it. I love you. You're magical.
I, I love you too, Rob.
And I can't
Yeah,
wait for more talks.
I hope that maybe one day you and I can go experience Acadia together. And I would love to see all the listeners out there and I'd love to show you around. So hopefully you guys will have a great trip out there sometime.
Well,
Yeah.
let's just put on the calendar now that August 4th I'll be there.
Oh, all
Putting that
right.
out there right now. So, all right, everyone, thanks so much for listening. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Colleen, thanks for being here. And we will talk to all y'all later. Two Travel Dads podcast is created by Rob and Chris Taylor in St. Augustine, Florida. We'd love to answer your questions here on the podcast, providing both our experience and stories to share our own insights into whatever you're wondering about. Visit twotraveldads.com/podcast-episodes to leave your questions and to check out past episodes and show notes. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and have an awesome day.